The first thing you notice about Bill O'Reilly's story is the sheer scale of his rise. You aren't just looking at another television host who lucked into a camera slot. You're watching a man who became the face of an entire network and, for years, the most dominant personality in American cable news. His path from Levittown, a post-war planned community on Long Island, all the way to the glittering studio lights of Fox News Channel is one of both ambition and carefully honed persona. And that S where your journey into Bill O'Reilly, how a media giant fell, begins by standing in the shadow of a man who once seemed untouchable. Welcome, my friend, to tonight's story on 102 Hours, where the world grows quiet and your mind drifts into the dimly lit corridors of power, scandal, and mystery. You're here with me, just the two of us, sifting through the public life of a figure who shaped nightly debates in millions of homes. If you enjoy these late-night explorations, take a gentle moment to like this video, subscribe for more true crime and mysteries, and if you'd like, drop your location and local time down below so we can all see where in the world you are listening from right now. It's a small ritual, but it connects us, just as O'Reilly once connected with his audience through the flicker of a TV screen. Tonight, we pull back the curtain and trace the beginnings of a media empire, and eventually, its dramatic collapse. You start with the foundation. O'Reilly was born in 1949 in Manhattan, but his formative years in Levittown shaped the man he would become. It was a suburb designed for order, conformity, and upward mobility. Families lived in nearly identical houses, built fast and cheap for returning soldiers and their families. Growing up in this environment, O'Reilly carried both the aspirations and the sharp edges of that blue-collar backdrop. He later described his childhood as ordinary, but peppered with lessons about toughness, an image he leaned on heavily in his career. Investigators still question whether that early life was as humble and difficult as he painted it, or if some details were carefully polished to reinforce his straight-shooter from the block identity. Education was his launchpad. After attending Chaminade High School, a Catholic boys' school, he enrolled at Marist College in upstate New York. There, he studied history, but more importantly, he worked on the school newspaper and started developing a flair for communication. By the 1970s, he moved into teaching, briefly working as a high school teacher before pursuing journalism more directly, a quirky tidbit. During this period, O'Reilly also played semi-professional baseball, something he liked to bring up occasionally in interviews, adding a layer of rugged Americana to his persona. It wasn't just words on paper that mattered to him. He was shaping a persona that combined intellectual weight with athletic grit. You then watch him enter broadcasting in earnest. His early years were scattered across small and mid-market stations. Places like Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Dallas, Texas, where he worked as a reporter and anchor, gave him his first taste of on-air presence. He was sharp, forceful, and quick to challenge conventional delivery styles. That aggressiveness drew attention, both positive and negative. A historical fact stands out here. In the 1980s, O'Reilly joined CBS News and later ABC News, covering global events from wars to papal visits. These were not small assignments. He built credibility as a journalist who could handle high-stakes reporting. But credibility alone wasn't enough. O'Reilly's real leap came in 1989, when he became the anchor of Inside Edition, a syndicated tabloid-style news program. At the time, the show was considered sensationalist, focusing on stories of crime, celebrity, and human interest. O'Reilly bristled at that label, though. He insisted he brought seriousness and journalistic standards to a format often dismissed as fluff, and whether you agreed or not, you can see how Inside Edition became the stage where he mastered his sharp, confrontational delivery. A curious, almost fringe-like detail. O'Reilly famously clashed with producers over teleprompter mishaps, one of which leaked as a behind-the-scenes outburst, "We'll do it live." That went viral decades later, long before viral was even a word. That clip, raw and unfiltered, oddly reinforced the exact persona he'd later cultivate on Fox. No nonsense, explosive, authentic. The stage was set for his greatest move yet. By 1996, Rupert Murdoch A.S.'s fledgling Fox News channel was looking for personalities who could cut through the noise and draw loyal viewers. O'Reilly, with his fiery delivery and strong-willed identity, was the perfect match. The O'Reilly Factor debuted the same year, introducing audiences to what he called the no-spin zone. Here, you see how his carefully built background, the tough Long Island kid, the serious reporter, the frustrated anchor, came together into a single package. He presented himself as the guy who cut through the lies of politicians and media elites, speaking for ordinary Americans who felt ignored or misled. By the early 2000s, his ratings dominated cable news. He wasn't just hosting a show, he was shaping political conversations. Presidents appeared on his program. Cultural debates raged nightly around his interviews. And yet, even as he towered over the industry, there were whispers of something else. Behind-the-scenes conflicts, accusations of arrogance, and a temper that sometimes boiled over. You get the sense, even here in his rise, that the seeds of his fall were already planted. Looking back, it feels like inevitability hiding in plain sight. O'Reilly had become both a household name and a lightning rod. The Levittown boy who once blended into cookie-cutter streets now stood at the peak of media power. But every empire, no matter how mighty, begins to show cracks. And in his case, the cracks would eventually shatter the entire facade. You settle into your seat as the lights dim, and the words, "the no-spin zone," flash across your imagination. The phrase is bold, almost confrontational, as if daring you to disagree. Bill O'Reilly coined it as the slogan for the O'Reilly Factor, and it became more than just branding. It was a promise, a shield, and a weapon all at once. To his millions of viewers, O'Reilly wasn't spinning. He was cutting through the noise, speaking directly, telling truths no one else would dare. But as you listen more closely, you notice the paradox. What happens when the myth of being spin-free is itself part of the spin? That S, where the heart of this chapter in Bill O'Reilly, How a Media Giant Fell, lies. The phrase first appeared in 2000 as part of O'Reilly's nightly introduction, delivered in his booming baritone, "You're entering the no-spin zone." It carried a hypnotic simplicity, like crossing a threshold from deception into clarity. His audience, mostly older, conservative-leaning Americans, adored the framing. They felt shielded from manipulation, safe in a place where someone would tell it like it is. And the numbers confirmed it. By the mid-2000s, O'Reilly consistently held the top-rated program in cable news, sometimes doubling the audience of CNN or MSNBC competitors. His interviews with politicians, from George W. Bush to Barack Obama, became essential viewing, not because of policy depth, but because you couldn't predict when O'Reilly might explode, interrupt, or corner his guest. The show's success also reflected broader shifts in media. As traditional journalism tried to maintain a veneer of objectivity, Fox News and O'Reilly tapped into something rawer: emotional connection, grievance, and a sense of loyalty. A mainstream historical fact makes this clear. After 9/11, Fox News surged past CNN to become the most watched cable news network, and O'Reilly stood at the center of that wave. His framing of terrorism, patriotism, and dissent resonated deeply with viewers who wanted a firm hand guiding them through uncertainty. Still, cracks appeared beneath the polished, no-spin veneer. Former colleagues described him as difficult, even tyrannical, behind the scenes. He clashed with producers, berated staff, and bristled at even small challenges to his authority. A quirky tidbit slipped out during one interview when O'Reilly revealed he sometimes prepared for shows by talking out loud to himself in his office, rehearsing lines with the intensity of a stage actor. It sounds almost theatrical, and maybe that's the point. The no-spin zone was less a news segment and more a nightly performance, one that blurred the line between journalism and theater. and you notice how the myth begins to show itself. O'Reilly claimed to present facts without bias, but his critics pointed out the clear ideological leanings baked into his questions and commentary. His framing of immigrants, feminists, or celebrities often carried more heat than light. No spin became a rallying cry, but also a tool. He spun himself as the only one not spinning, a rhetorical trick both brilliant and slippery. Investigators still question whether his nightly battles with guests were genuinely unscripted clashes or carefully orchestrated theater to reinforce the illusion of fearless honesty. This paradox was part of his allure. Fans tuned in to see him berate what he called the pinheads of the world. Detractors tuned in to watch him lose his temper. Either way, everyone watched, and O'Reilly knew it. In fact, he leaned into the controversy, publishing books like The O'Reilly Factor and Culture Warrior that expanded the no-spin persona into bookstores, lecture halls, and eventually a lucrative side business of speaking tours. Behind the curtain, however, whispers continued to grow. Staffers who felt belittled or intimidated rarely spoke out publicly. But inside the newsroom, stories circulated about how hard it was to work under him. His critics outside Fox accused him of building a personality cult, rather than a journalistic platform. A curious fringe tidbit comes from his feud with fellow conservative host Glenn Beck, who once hinted on air that O'Reilly's no spin mantra was more of a marketing hook than a moral code. Imagine that, being called out for spin by another spinner. And yet, as you sit here in the quiet, you realize how effective it all was. The myth of the no-spin zone insulated O'Reilly from criticism for years. Supporters could dismiss accusations as spin from jealous rivals or biased outlets. Enemies could rage, but the ratings barely wavered. For more than a decade, the myth worked. The empire thrived. But myths, like empires, are fragile things. They endure until reality presses too hard against the facade. O'Reilly's no-spin zone would soon collide with allegations, lawsuits, and revelations that no slogan could shield him from. The same blunt force he wielded on air, the outbursts, the interruptions, the self-assuredness, would eventually resurface in another arena, one far more damaging than any televised debate. You picture the bright studio lights, the booming theme music, and Bill O'Reilly settling into his chair with the confidence of a man who knows he owns the hour. Night after night, millions tune in. And yet, behind the commanding presence and carefully rehearsed no-spin zone, the first fractures are starting to show. That's how it always begins. Quietly, almost imperceptibly. One moment you're staring at the polished glass of an empire. The next, you notice faint hairline cracks. With Bill O'Reilly, how a media giant fell, those cracks tell you just as much about his rise as they do about his eventual collapse. The whispers started in the 1990s, not long after the O'Reilly Factor launched. Staffers at Fox described him as unpredictable, brilliant one day, furious the next. A mainstream historical fact illustrates this perfectly. In 2000, O'Reilly got into a very public feud with comedian Al Franken at the Book Expo America convention. Franken challenged O'Reilly's claims about winning a journalism award, and the spat turned into a shouting match in front of a live audience. The press devoured it. For O'Reilly's fans, the confrontation only reinforced his no-nonsense image. For critics, it exposed a sensitive ego and a willingness to bend truth to bolster his legend. Inside the Fox newsroom, tales circulated about his temper. Some producers described a man who didn't just argue but shouted, slammed fists, and demanded control down to the smallest detail. O'Reilly later admitted in interviews that he could be tough to work with, a phrase that feels like an understatement when you imagine the pressure of delivering a nightly show under his command. A quirky tidbit surfaces here. O'Reilly once told an interviewer that before big broadcasts he would psych himself up with boxing metaphors, seeing himself as a fighter stepping into the ring. That framing explains why so many of his interviews felt less like journalism and more like combat sports. The cracks weren't just about temperament, they also touched his personal image. By the early 2000s, tabloids began publishing stories about his lavish lifestyle, his mansions, his collection of expensive art, and his sharp business dealings. For someone who branded himself as a voice of ordinary Americans, the image of private jets and multi-million-dollar estates rang differently with critics. Investigators still question whether O'Reilly fully understood the contradiction between his blue-collar rhetoric and high-rolling reality, or if he simply didn't care. Meanwhile, his show became notorious for aggressive confrontations. He cut off guests mid-sentence, raised his voice, and often dominated debates to the point where viewers wondered why anyone would agree to appear. And yet, they kept coming, because the exposure was irresistible. A fringe-like anecdote comes from when O'Reilly invited a small-town high school principal onto the show after a controversy about banning patriotic songs at a school assembly. The segment was short, heated, and humiliating for the guest, but O'Reilly's fans loved it. That dynamic, turning ordinary figures into foils, further solidified his reputation as a cultural warrior, but it also fed accusations of bullying. By the mid-2000s, more serious murmurs emerged. Staff turnover at the O'Reilly Factor was unusually high. Former employees suggested that the atmosphere was tense, even toxic. While no formal complaints surfaced publicly at this stage, media reporters noted the pattern. In 2004, one journalist wrote that O'Reilly's success was sustained less by charm than by intimidation. The description stuck, and for those paying close attention, it foreshadowed the more damaging revelations to come. And then came the signs of unease among Fox executives. Though O'Reilly was their star, bringing in unmatched ratings and advertising dollars, his growing list of feuds, whether with celebrities, comedians, or even colleagues, caused concern. Fox had weathered storms before, but this was different. O'Reilly was too big to discipline without risking backlash from his loyal audience. In many ways, his early cracks showed how Fox itself was being reshaped. They were building an empire on a foundation with hairline fractures, hoping it would never collapse. When you pause here, you see the pattern forming. Every empire has its golden years, but it also carries its vulnerabilities. O'Reilly's temper, his contradictions, and his tendency to treat interviews as fights all hinted at something fragile beneath the bluster. To most viewers at the time, those cracks looked like quirks, part of the charm of a larger-than-life figure. But as you know now, those quirks were early warning signs of something deeper, an empire that might not withstand the weight of scandal. The empire begins to tremble in October 2004. You picture the scene. Bill O'Reilly, then at the height of his power, sits in a sleek Manhattan office preparing for another night in the no-spin zone. His ratings are untouchable, his brand unshakable, or so it seems. But behind the scenes, a lawsuit has just been filed that threatens not only his reputation but also the foundations of Fox News itself. The plaintiff is Andrea Macris, a young associate producer who had worked directly with O'Reilly. What she alleges sends shockwaves across the media world, and you find yourself leaning closer, realizing this is no longer just about politics and television. It's about the man himself. Macris's lawsuit accused O'Reilly of sexual harassment. She described late-night phone calls filled with inappropriate comments, graphic fantasies, and unwanted advances. The accusations, laid out in stark legal language, contrasted brutally with O'Reilly's polished public image as the blunt but principled truth-teller. For viewers who tuned in nightly to hear him rail against cultural decline, this was a revelation that felt like betrayal, a mainstream historical fact. O'Reilly responded not with silence, but with fury, filing a countersuit accusing Macris and her attorney of extortion. He stood on air and told his audience he was the victim of a brutal attempt to extort millions of dollars. His defiance turned the case into a spectacle. But outside the Fox News bubble, the details drew intense scrutiny. The transcripts of the alleged phone calls were explicit, often bizarre. They included descriptions of Caribbean vacations, shower scenes, and personal acts that clashed painfully with his family values persona. For days, late-night comedians and rival networks had a field day, replaying the details with both shock and sarcasm. A quirky tidbit comes from Jon Stewart, who devoted an entire segment to lampooning the language of the transcripts, joking that O'Reilly had unwittingly written some of the strangest romance lines ever committed to legal filings. Inside Fox, the reaction was more cautious. Executives had seen scandals before, but not one this close to their crown jewel. O'Reilly had been with the network since its launch in 1996, and by 2004, The O'Reilly Factor was not just a program, but the anchor of Fox's dominance. Losing him, or even admitting a serious breach, felt unthinkable. Yet the lawsuit loomed, threatening to drag Fox into discovery, with the possibility of private conversations and internal documents spilling into the public record. Investigators still question whether Fox pressured O'Reilly behind the scenes to settle quickly, or if the decision was his own, aimed at protecting both brand and network. And settle he did. Just weeks after the case erupted, O'Reilly and Macris reached a confidential agreement. The lawsuit was withdrawn, his countersuit quietly dismissed, and life at Fox seemed to resume. Only later, through investigative reporting, did the world learn that the settlement was reportedly around $9 million. O'Reilly never admitted wrongdoing, and Fox never confirmed the figure, but the deal spoke volumes. When corporations pay that much to close a case, the public is left to draw its own conclusions. For O'Reilly's fans, the incident became another battlefield. Many accepted his version, that he was the target of opportunists trying to cash in on his fame. His ratings, remarkably, held steady. The O'Reilly Factor continued dominating cable news. He even joked in later interviews that people had moved on. Yet, in truth, something had shifted. The invincible armor of his persona had been dented. The no-spin zone was no longer entirely free of spin. From a cultural perspective, this moment foreshadowed larger reckonings. In 2004, workplace harassment was still often swept under the rug. Settlements were common, silence was purchased, and powerful men frequently emerged with reputations bruised but intact. O'Reilly embodied that system. He had resources, lawyers, and a network invested in his survival. Macris, meanwhile, disappeared from the public spotlight, her story reduced to a footnote in the larger narrative of his career. A fringe detail emerges years later, when Macris, in a rare interview, reflected on the toll of the case. She described feeling abandoned, silenced, and disillusioned, not only with O'Reilly but with the culture that allowed such behavior to persist. Her voice, nearly lost in the cacophony of political media, became part of a longer timeline of women speaking out against harassment. Looking back, you see this lawsuit as a turning point, even if it didn't topple O'Reilly right away. The cracks were no longer just whispers or backstage tantrums. They were now public record, tied to legal filings, settlements, and national headlines. His empire survived 2004, but the cost of survival was steep. Millions of dollars, damaged credibility, and the quiet knowledge that more allegations might one day surface. And, of course, they would. You close your eyes and imagine the glittering Fox News headquarters in Midtown Manhattan in the years after 2004. To the outside world, everything looks steady. The ratings are strong, the studio hums with energy, and Bill O'Reilly still towers over cable news like a colossus. But if you look closer, you see a different picture. Behind the glass facade, the company's lawyers are busy. Confidential documents circulate, checks are written, and one by one, settlements begin to stack up. This is the part of Bill O'Reilly, how a media giant fell where the whispers turn into patterns, and the patterns into something undeniable. The Andrea Macris lawsuit might have been the first major public crack, but it wasn't the last. In the years that followed, more women, producers, on-air personalities, and staff came forward with allegations of inappropriate conduct, intimidation, or harassment. Most of these never saw the inside of a courtroom. Instead, they were quietly resolved behind closed doors. A mainstream historical fact makes this clear. By 2017, investigations revealed that O'Reilly and Fox had paid at least $13 million in settlements to 5 different women over a span of more than a decade. These weren't rumors. They were documented payouts, each one designed to end a dispute before it reached public scrutiny. The secrecy was deliberate. Settlement agreements often included non-disclosure clauses, effectively silencing the women involved. O'Reilly, for his part, continued to insist he had done nothing wrong, framing the payouts as the unfortunate cost of being a high-profile target. He told interviewers that he was vulnerable to lawsuits because of his fame, and that settling was often cheaper and less damaging than fighting. It's a clever line of defense, but as you know, it also sidesteps the obvious question. If there was nothing there, why pay so much so often? Investigators still question whether these settlements were about convenience or about preserving the carefully guarded image of the no-spin zone. The women who did speak publicly painted a picture that was difficult to ignore. Lori Dew, a former Fox anchor, alleged that a culture of harassment ran deep in the network. Juliette Huddy, another on-air personality, later revealed details of her own settlement, describing unwanted advances and career retaliation when she rejected them. Each case added a new layer to the narrative. Not a single isolated event, but a pattern of behavior that seemed to stretch across years. A quirky tidbit surfaces in the middle of all this. O'Reilly, even as these stories simmered, was writing his hugely successful Killing book series, Killing Lincoln, Killing Kennedy, Killing Jesus. These historical thrillers topped bestseller lists, making him one of the most profitable authors in America. The juxtaposition is surreal. On one hand, he was a family name author, shaping how millions consumed history. On the other, his employer was signing checks in secret, keeping allegations buried. As if 2 O'Reillys existed side by side, the polished public historian and the subject of whispered legal agreements. Fox News itself wasn't blind to the risks. Executives weighed the cost of protecting their star against the potential fallout. At the time, it seemed like a fair trade. Settlements could be written off, reputations patched, and the ratings machine could keep rolling. In hindsight, you realize they weren't just covering for O'Reilly. They were building a culture that normalized secrecy. This culture wouldn't collapse until much later, when Roger Ailes, the network's founder, faced his own avalanche of allegations. O'Reilly's settlements were part of that same pattern, hidden in plain sight. Publicly, O'Reilly carried on as if nothing had happened. On air, he was the same, fiery, sarcastic, indignant. His audience barely knew about the settlements, and those who did often dismissed them as smears from political enemies. The shield of partisanship worked well for him. For years, his viewers treated criticism as confirmation that he must be doing something right. But silence has a cost. By the mid-2010s, journalists outside Fox started to dig deeper. The secrecy that had protected O'Reilly was itself becoming a story. When you pay millions to keep allegations quiet, eventually someone asks why. The pattern was too large to ignore, and reporters smelled blood. Looking back, you see how the settlements, stacked one after another, functioned like sandbags against a rising tide. Each one kept the flood at bay for a time, but the water level only rose higher. By the time the world learned the true scope, the damage was already irreparable. For years, the public saw Titan untouched by scandal, but the truth was that the foundation had been steadily eroded by confidential agreements and the silence of women who had tried to speak out. And when that silence finally broke, it would shatter everything. You're sitting at your desk, scrolling through headlines on a brisk April morning in 2017, when one story stops you cold. The New York Times has published a sweeping investigation into Bill O'Reilly. And suddenly the quiet settlements, the whispered rumors, and the carefully hidden disputes are all laid bare in the stark light of day. For years, you've seen him brush off critics, wave away lawsuits, and continue to dominate the ratings. But this article feels different. This is not just gossip. It's not partisan attack. It's documented, detailed, and devastating. The report reveals that O'Reilly and Fox News had together paid $13 million in settlements to 5 women who had accused him of sexual harassment or inappropriate behavior. The piece carefully outlines each case, naming names, citing documents, and confirming what had long been suspected but never proven. One of the women, Juliet Huddy, had accused O'Reilly of pursuing a sexual relationship with her and punishing her career when she refused. Another, Lori Dew, had received a 7-figure settlement after raising similar complaints. Andrea Macris, whose case in 2004 first exposed O'Reilly's private behavior, was also revisited, showing how it fit into the larger pattern. The Times article doesn't just break news, it connects the dots. The timing of the exposé is crucial. It lands just months after Roger Ailes, Fox News' powerful founder, had been forced out following a flood of harassment allegations from women inside the network. The atmosphere had changed. America was no longer content to let these accusations be brushed aside as the cost of doing business in television. The cultural mood was shifting, and the Me Too movement was about to explode. Suddenly, the shield of secrecy that had protected men like Ailes and O'Reilly for years was cracking. O'Reilly's response is immediate. He releases a statement insisting he is innocent, claiming that the settlements were meant to protect his children from public spectacle and that the allegations are false. He calls the Times article a political hit job, orchestrated by those who want to destroy him. Fox initially backs him, echoing that he remains a valued voice. But outside the newsroom, you see a different reaction. The public is no longer shrugging. Social media erupts with outrage. Women who had once stayed silent begin to feel emboldened to share their stories. Advertisers, sensitive to public perception, are watching closely. One quirky but telling detail emerges. In the days after the Times article drops, O'Reilly goes on vacation, framing it as a pre-planned break. But viewers notice the odd timing. It looks less like a holiday and more like a retreat under fire. Late-night comedians have a field day with the irony. Here is the king of the no-spin zone, suddenly spinning his own absence as if nothing were wrong. What makes the exposé so powerful is not just the money or the accusations. It's the cumulative weight. For years, these incidents had been treated as isolated storms, each one contained and forgotten. The Times ties them into a single narrative, exposing not just O'Reilly, but the machinery of protection at Fox News. The article makes it clear. This wasn't about one man's behavior, it was about a network that paid to make problems disappear. And as you read the article, you sense the shift in momentum. Before, O'Reilly was untouchable, shielded by ratings, revenue, and influence. Now, he looks vulnerable. For the first time in decades, it feels like his fate isn't entirely in his hands. When you close the paper, or more likely, your browser tab, you realize you've just witnessed the moment the dam broke. The settlements could be hidden, the whispers ignored. But once the Times exposé hit the public record, there was no going back. The king of cable news had been dragged into the open, and the fall was no longer a question of if, but when. You're watching TV one evening in April 2017, tuned into Fox News like millions of others, when you notice something odd. The commercials aren't what they used to be. Gone are the polished car ads, the travel spots, the glossy tech promotions that had always filled the breaks during the O'Reilly factor. Instead, you're seeing ads for obscure products, lower budget promotions, and even network filler content. It feels like the show's shine has dulled overnight. And then you realize why. Advertisers are leaving. Within days of the New York Times exposé, the financial backbone of O'Reilly's empire begins to collapse. Over 50 major companies, including Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Hyundai, and GlaxoSmithKline, publicly announced they are pulling their ads from the factor. You see the statements roll in, each one striking the same tone. While they won't weigh in on the allegations directly, they cannot in good conscience let their brand be tied to the scandal. For a man who has built his career on ratings, numbers, and power, this corporate exodus is the first unmistakable sign that his dominance is no longer sustainable. Historically, advertisers had tolerated controversy. They overlooked fiery monologues, polarizing politics, even the occasional lawsuit, so long as the ratings delivered. But now, the public backlash is too loud. The hashtag #DropO'Reilly trends across social media, a digital protest campaign that floods corporate inboxes with demands for accountability. The shift is cultural, and it's immediate. Once, O'Reilly seemed untouchable. Now, the companies that helped fund his show are racing to distance themselves. In a quirky twist, one report notes that several of the remaining ads aired during The Factor were for medical alert systems and survival gear, products aimed squarely at O'Reilly's aging core audience. It becomes a joke online, with viewers noting that his sponsors have aged right alongside him. The irony isn't lost. A man who once commanded premium ad dollars is now left with niche spots that signal decline. Fox News executives try to reassure advertisers, insisting the show remains a top ratings draw. And it does. O'Reilly's numbers actually spike in the short term, fueled by viewers rallying to his defense. But advertisers don't return. For them, it isn't about viewership, it's about optics. Appearing in the middle of a program synonymous with harassment allegations is now a liability, not an opportunity. Behind the scenes, investigators still question whether the boycott alone could have forced Fox's hand, or whether it was merely the final straw. Some argue the Murdoch family had already been considering O'Reilly's removal after the ale scandal made the network's culture a liability. Others believe that money always talks, and the advertiser flight was the only factor that truly mattered. Either way, you see the writing on the wall. O'Reilly, for his part, tries to brush it off. He insists that the advertisers will come back, that the show is too powerful to fail. On air, his tone remains defiant, unchanged, as if nothing is happening behind the scenes. But off-screen, the walls are closing in. A television giant who once seemed immune to public pressure is watching his empire weaken, not because of politics or ratings, but because of a marketplace that no longer wants him. And so, with every commercial break that feels emptier than the last, you understand what's happening. The advertisers aren't just leaving, they're signaling the end. You picture the quiet tension inside Fox News headquarters in mid-April 2017. The walls of glass and steel reflect a network in crisis, and behind closed doors, the Murdoch family faces one of the most consequential choices in its history. Bill O'Reilly has been the face of Fox for nearly 2 decades, the ratings juggernaut who made the O'Reilly Factor the most watched cable news show in America. But now, the name that once brought in billions is a liability. You imagine Rupert Murdoch, the patriarch, balancing loyalty with pragmatism. He has long valued O'Reilly's dominance, and their relationship stretches back to the early years of Fox News. Yet his sons, James and Lachlan, are pressing harder. They've been steering the company toward a sleeker, more modern image, especially as 21st Century Fox eyes a massive takeover of Sky in the UK. Allegations of sexual harassment hanging over their top star threaten not only Fox News, but also the family's broader global ambitions. Meetings are called, executives gather. The conversations are terse, clipped, but decisive. The settlements revealed by the Times are impossible to spin away, and the advertiser boycott has turned into a financial hemorrhage. In this context, you see the calculus: keep O'Reilly and risk further reputational collapse, or cut him loose and attempt to reset the network's image. One quirky but telling moment leaks from those tense days. O'Reilly had taken his so-called vacation to Italy, where he was spotted shaking hands with Pope Francis in St. Peter's Square. The photo makes headlines around the world. To supporters, it looks like divine vindication. To critics, a tone-deaf attempt at damage control. For the Murdochs, though, the optics are irrelevant. They are weighing power, money, and survival. Investigators still question whether the Murdoch sons forced their father's hand, or whether Rupert himself finally saw that O'Reilly had become unsalvageable. Some say Rupert wanted to stand by his star, but James and Lachlan argued too strongly to ignore. Others believe the entire family understood that the long game, protecting their global business empire, mattered more than protecting one host. On April 19, 2017, the decision becomes official. Fox News announces that Bill O'Reilly will not return. The statement is short, almost cold, thanking him for his contributions but offering no fanfare, no glowing tribute. After more than 20 years, his reign ends with a press release. Inside Fox, reactions are mixed. Some employees are relieved, seeing it as long overdue accountability. Others are shocked, unable to believe the most powerful man in cable news could be toppled so quickly. For viewers, it's a jarring shift. One night, O'Reilly is still hosting his show. The next, he is gone, erased from the lineup, his presence wiped clean. You sit with the realization. The Murdoch family, the only power strong enough to end O'Reilly's career, has acted. And by doing so, they've confirmed what the advertisers, the accusers, and the Times had already shown. The empire wasn't invincible after all. You imagine Bill O'Reilly leaving the Fox News studios for the last time in April 2017, his familiar chair empty, the cameras off, the theme music silent. For the first time in decades, the man who dominated cable news primetime is untethered. No ratings numbers to obsess over, no live debates to control, no advertisers to reassure. And yet, the world hasn't entirely abandoned him. In Bill O'Reilly, How a Media Giant Fell, this chapter is about survival, reinvention, and the quiet shadow that scandal casts even over the most resilient figures. Immediately, O'Reilly pivots to other ventures. Podcasts, books, and online appearances become his new stage. No Spin News, his post-Fox platform, allows him to speak directly to a devoted fan base, bypassing traditional gatekeepers. Historical fact: in 2018, his podcast reached tens of thousands of downloads per episode, proving that his voice, controversial or not, still carries weight. You see the persistence of audience loyalty as a kind of lifeline, keeping him in public consciousness even after the network cut him loose. Yet, the world has changed. Advertisers are cautious, and mainstream media often frames him as disgraced or fallen. Even among former supporters, there's a sense of distance, a hesitation to embrace the man uncritically. The contrast is stark. On one hand, a figure accustomed to influence; on the other, the sobering reality that fame is fragile and reputation is a currency easily devalued. Behind the scenes, O'Reilly continues to generate controversy. Social media amplifies his opinions, often drawing sharp criticism for political commentary or his defense of past actions. A quirky tidbit: he reportedly maintains a collection of historical assassination maps, referencing them in his Killing series and personal musings. A peculiar mix of history obsession and personal theater. Fans find it fascinating. Critics find it emblematic of his sometimes obsessive personality. Investigators still question whether O'Reilly ever truly confronted the long-term consequences of the allegations against him. Settlements and denials can temporarily protect a career, but the public narrative has shifted. The untouchable aura is gone. Even in success, there's a persistent echo of what was lost: a network, a brand, a cultural dominance that can never be fully regained. He also returns to book writing with renewed intensity. Titles in his Killing series top bestseller lists, drawing both fans and criticism for dramatizing history. For a while, this literary success softens the blow of his television departure. It's a reminder that influence can take many forms, not all of them televised or monetized through traditional advertising. Yet, despite this reinvention, the shadow of scandal never fully disappears. When news breaks about other high-profile harassment cases, O'Reilly is frequently referenced, a touchstone in broader conversations about workplace culture and accountability. In this way, his life after Fox becomes a dual existence, one of continuing influence and one of persistent scrutiny. The lesson is subtle but clear. Even the most powerful public figures, when confronted with systemic allegations and shifting societal expectations, must navigate a new reality. Fame can be resilient, but the structures that sustain it, trust, credibility, and institutional support, can crumble faster than ratings charts. You realize as you reflect that this chapter isn't just about a career rebound. It's about the enduring tension between legacy and reputation, between public perception and private reality. For O'Reilly, life after Fox is a careful balance of asserting influence while managing the indelible mark left by his very public fall. You step back from Bill O'Reilly's personal story and look at the wider landscape of Fox News during the Ailes era. What you notice is a pattern, repeated behaviors, hidden settlements, and a culture where powerful men were insulated from accountability. Bill O'Reilly. How a media giant fell isn't just about one host. It's a lens through which you can see systemic issues that shaped a network, an industry, and the very way cable news operated for decades. Historical fact anchors this pattern. Roger Ailes, the founder of Fox News, faced multiple sexual harassment allegations before his 2016 ouster. His behavior created a hierarchical culture where subordinates, especially women, feared speaking out. Within this environment, O'Reilly thrived. He mirrored Ailes's aggressive, domineering style and benefited from the same lack of internal checks. Investigators still question whether Fox's top executives knowingly tolerated this behavior because the ratings and profits were too lucrative to risk intervention. The network's internal dynamics reveal an unsettling symmetry. Allegations were often met with quiet settlements, non-disclosure agreements, and managerial pressure to remain silent. Employees described fear of retaliation and a sense that ambition demanded complicity. In this context, O'Reilly's rise and eventual fall are not isolated. They are part of a network-wide approach that prioritized brand protection over individual accountability. Quirky tidbit. Anecdotal accounts suggest that informal golf club meetings and private dinners between executives often determined how cases would be handled. More strategy than morality, more image management than justice. It's almost theatrical when you think about it. The fate of high-profile employees decided over drinks rather than through transparent formal channels. Yet, the larger pattern is what really strikes you. For years, the network's culture enabled misconduct while maintaining an image of professionalism and authority to the public. O'Reilly's dominance was a symptom of a system where ratings were paramount and personal behavior was negotiable. It was profitable in the short term, but as societal norms evolved and media scrutiny intensified, the system's fragility was exposed. When you consider this, it becomes clear that O'Reilly's story is intertwined with Fox News itself. His personal misconduct and the network's protective measures reflect broader systemic failures in media accountability. By understanding this, you see that the fall of one star isn't just individual drama. It is a microcosm of how culture, power, and complicity converge in high-stakes environments. You feel the pulse of the nation shifting in early 2017 as the O'Reilly scandal unfolds against the backdrop of a broader cultural awakening. The New York Times expose and subsequent advertiser boycott coincide with growing awareness of workplace harassment in media, politics, and entertainment. In Bill O'Reilly, How a Media Giant Fell, this section captures how one man's fall became emblematic of a societal reckoning, signaling that no star, no matter how powerful, was immune to public scrutiny. The historical fact here is clear. O'Reilly's dismissal occurs months before the T-shirt Me Too movement explodes. Yet it is widely cited as a precursor that helped galvanize cultural conversation. Audiences begin questioning the systems that allowed behavior to remain unchecked for decades. Viewers who once championed O'Reilly's blunt honesty now confront the dissonance between his on-air persona and off-air conduct. Investigators still question whether the fallout could have been prevented if corporate accountability had been stronger years earlier. Public discourse quickly splits into polarized camps. Some defend O'Reilly, framing him as a victim of a coordinated media attack or a politically motivated campaign. Others celebrate his removal as overdue justice. This bifurcation reflects more than fandom. It mirrors society's struggle to reconcile long-standing admiration for powerful figures with the necessity of ethical accountability. A quirky tidbit underscores the cultural tension. Late-night comedy shows create a recurring gag around the no-spin zone, being replaced with no-cash zone, lampooning the financial and reputational collapse in a playful, if biting, cultural commentary. It's absurd, yet it captures the zeitgeist. An empire built on personality and ratings can crumble in the face of public conscience. Meanwhile, journalists and academics begin analyzing Fox News' internal culture, O'Reilly's settlements, and the network's crisis management as a case study in corporate complicity. The narrative moves beyond individual misconduct to systemic critique. The public conversation shifts from scandal to culture, ethics, and accountability, reflecting a broader societal demand that power must be exercised responsibly and that consequences should be unavoidable when it is not. For the viewers following this story, the takeaway is sobering. O'Reilly's fall is both personal and symbolic. It demonstrates how decades of unchecked behavior can erode even the most seemingly indestructible public personas. It reminds you that fame and ratings offer no immunity, and that society's expectations of accountability are evolving. In this reckoning, you sense both closure and the opening of broader conversations about media ethics, workplace culture, and the fragility of public trust. The fall of one media giant becomes a lens through which an entire industry, and indeed an entire culture, re-examines itself. You sit quietly, imagining the echo of footsteps through the empty studio of the O'Reilly Factor. The cameras no longer roll, the lights no longer shine, and the no-spin zone is a memory. Bill O'Reilly's reign is over, and what remains is a complicated legacy, one that blends journalistic achievement, cultural influence, and scandal into a single, uneasy portrait. Bill O'Reilly. How a media giant fell ends here, not with a dramatic explosion, but with reflection. What does it mean when power, fame, and accountability collide? Historically, O'Reilly transformed cable news. He defined the opinion host model, blending commentary, debate, and celebrity interviews into a nightly spectacle. Millions tuned in not just for news, but for the performance, the persona, the sense that they were witnessing fearless truth-telling. Ratings soared, advertisers flocked, and O'Reilly became a cultural touchstone, sometimes revered, often reviled, but never ignored. Yet the quirky human details reveal a more nuanced picture. Behind the polished on-air presence, there was a man meticulous in preparation, rehearsing interviews aloud, obsessing over phrasing, and carefully curating his public image. He embodied both confidence and insecurity, ambition and fear, charisma and controversy. These contradictions fueled both his meteoric rise and the eventual unraveling. Investigators still question whether O'Reilly ever truly reconciled his public persona with private behavior, or whether the tension between the two was inevitable. The settlements, the lawsuits, and the exposés are more than historical footnotes. They are part of a broader dialogue about power and responsibility. O'Reilly's case serves as a cautionary tale. Influence does not grant immunity, and charisma cannot shield misconduct indefinitely. For media professionals, corporate executives, and viewers alike, the story underscores the ethical obligations that accompany authority. Culturally, the fall reverberates beyond Fox News. It presaged the Me Too movement, informed discussions about workplace harassment, and shifted public expectations for accountability in high-profile industries. O'Reilly's departure demonstrated that even the most dominant figures can be challenged, and that societal norms are neither static nor forgiving of repeated abuses. And yet, legacy is complicated. O'Reilly remains a best-selling author, a public commentator, and a figure with loyal followers. His influence persists, albeit in a smaller, more circumscribed form. The juxtaposition is striking. A man who once dominated nightly news is now partially exiled, still relevant but no longer untouchable. It's a nuanced lesson in fame, power, and consequence. As you reflect on this story, the takeaway is neither simple nor comfortable. Bill O'Reilly: How a Media Giant Fell is a story of triumph, misjudgment, and reckoning. It reminds you that even the brightest stars cast shadows, that legacies are measured not just in ratings or profits but in ethical weight, and that the truth, like the no-spin zone O'Reilly once championed, cannot be hidden forever. The studio lights may dim, the cameras may stop, but the story lingers. And in that lingering, there is both warning and wisdom. A final note for anyone watching, listening, or learning from the rise and fall of a media giant. Take a deep breath and let the story settle around you. The rise and fall of Bill O'Reilly isn't just a tale of television ratings or media celebrity. It is a human story, a cautionary narrative about ambition, ethics, and consequence. You've traced the arc from a powerful media presence through legal battles and whispered settlements to the ultimate reckoning that reshaped both his career and the culture that enabled it. In reflecting, you can see the complexity. A man who informed and entertained millions, yet whose private actions ultimately undermined his public persona. The story asks you to consider the tension between persona and reality, between influence and accountability, and between admiration and scrutiny. For media consumers, it's a lesson in critical engagement, reminding you to look beyond the surface, question narratives, and remain aware of the systems that amplify or protect certain figures. It's also a moment to think about societal change. The culture that once tolerated unchecked behavior is evolving. The conversations sparked by O'Reilly's fall have contributed to broader movements demanding transparency, fairness, and justice. And while he continues to have a voice, it exists in a transformed landscape, smaller, more contested, and far more accountable than before. Now, as you sit in quiet reflection, imagine the studio doors closing behind him, the no-spin zone fading into history, and the lessons lingering in the spaces he once commanded. It's a reminder that every empire, no matter how powerful, has limits. Even giants fall. And in witnessing it, you've seen not only the end of a media reign but also the enduring value of ethical vigilance.